problem. Welcome back, everyone, to WE3Live. We have another fantastic session today, the Regulatory Commission's Priorities in Utility Data Regulation. Today's special guests are Sadzi Oliva. She's a former commissioner from the Illinois Commerce Commission, and back again is Darren Brady, the Chief Customer Officer at Smart Energy Water. Today, they're going to take a deep dive look at some of the implications of the rise of data across the utility enterprise and how that impacts policy, utilities, and ultimately customers. So with that, I'll hand it over to Darren and Sadzi for a great conversation. Darren, it's all yours.
Great. Thanks, Jason. And Sadzi, great. It's great having you here today and having you be a part of our WE3Live series. So thanks again. And just for the benefit of the audience, the conversations we've been having in these series are really designed to highlight the work going on across the industry and the activities across the different aspects of the business, all designed to kind of how to address climate change. So as Jason mentioned, today's discussion, we're going to focus on the regulatory arena and dive in a little bit on utility data and the concepts that we're seeing out there around regulated utility data platforms. So Sadzi, having you here, given your background with the Illinois Commerce Commission and obviously your activity in the industry space itself, is going to be great to get those insights. So once again, welcome. So one of the things we do, as the audience knows, is we try to ask a few questions early to give the audience a chance to better know the speaker. So if you don't mind, maybe we'll start with a couple as we kick it off. Fantastic. So great. So first off, maybe tell us a little bit about how you got yourself involved in the energy industry.
Well, first of all, thank you, Jason and WE3 and Darren for having me. So did energy find me or did I find energy? Energy found me in this completely random career that took me to different places, gave me leadership opportunities. I had the background for it in the sense that I had experience working in other state agencies, both on the social services side and on the regulatory side. So the only thing I needed to learn was all about energy, which I quickly did as quickly as humanly possible. And I still don't know everything, but energy found me.
That's fantastic. I'm just curious, I've been looking at your background. You've done so many things in your career already and a lot within the energy space just in that time frame. Are there any things that, specific roles or areas that stand out in the career so far?
Well, I mean, this most recent role that I've had as a commissioner at the Illinois Commerce Commission, which I did for 4 years, completely stands out as one that I just feel so fortunate to have held. The energy industry and sector is just an amazing place for anybody, who's looking for an exciting opportunity and a great place to work, because things change every day. And it's just so exciting to be part of all of these changes. Things that stand out in my career that facilitated the role that I just had. I worked at the Department of Children and Family Services. That was a social services agency tasked with the terrible subject matter of child abuse and neglect. But that helped me do my work as a regulator, because those are the types of agencies and the types of communities and social services agencies that are very impacted by what we do as regulators in the energy sector when it comes to affordability. And I know how important it is for families that are struggling. So I learned that, part of the energy sector, not even knowing that I was doing that while I was at DCFS. And then when I was a general counsel at another agency, I just learned about how much impact regulations have on the daily lives of everybody. So those two together really helped me to be a good energy and public service commission regulator.
Oh, that's fantastic. And I guess kind of along those lines, right, if you kind of think about at the beginning of your career and where you are now, what advice would you give to a young Sadzi kind of starting off where you were early in the process to where you've been today? What would be good guidance to give somebody?
Well, I mean, my experience, I'm a first generation Cuban American. So when I started school, I didn't speak English. I was lost from the very first day of school and preschool and through kindergarten when I finally figured it out. So I was always one that felt behind, and that taught me to try to be the most prepared and the most knowledgeable in the room. But what I would tell a younger me is find mentors. I mean, I was afraid. I didn't know you were allowed to talk to your professors in college. I had no idea. So if I knew back then that it was okay to talk to them and ask them for their help and reach out to them, I probably would have established mentors a lot more early than I did. But mentors, sponsors, so important to have in your career to navigate your career successfully.
Oh, I couldn't agree more. I personally have benefited from some great mentorship along the way as well. And I think those early in the career, sometimes you're exactly right. Don't reach out or sit in the back of the classroom where, you kind of maybe you're trying not to be as heard, and realize at the end that, those people can be really helpful and instrumental, not just in the current environment, but also looking forward, going forward. That's great advice. Well, let's maybe start with kind of just maybe reflecting a little bit on what your time in the commission, when you think about the years you were there, what are some, activities or maybe memorable moments that stand out during that tenure?
So there are a lot of, memorable moments that stand out. So much happened during the 4 years that I was there. When I first started, the focus was on innovation, technology, and how we were going to transform the grid, making it convenient for consumers to participate on the grid, and how that was all going to work itself out while maintaining our mission as regulators to balance the interests of utilities and consumers. So that was very exciting. And then if you look at the last part of my term, we were hit with something completely unexpected, the pandemic, and that just changed priorities across the country, where the main focus became affordability and, how are we going to work with the utilities to make sure that consumers that were struggling weren't going to be shut off from their utility services. So I would say that, things changed very quickly within the last year, and, just so happy at the way that everyone kind of stepped up together to work to, make it the best outcome that could possibly be here in Illinois, with stipulated agreements on disconnections and a moratorium on those disconnections, and then trying to find the best way to ease customers back into trying to be able to catch up and pay those bills.
And I think that, I think just in your tenure, you can, it's a great example of kind of the pace of change and the acceleration of that in the industry. And sometimes the unknown events that come our way from a macro perspective that kind of forces the industry to quickly, proactively address and react, right? And be able to make changes around it. I mean, when you think about that period of time over those 4 years, because they were kind of dealt with different issues during that time, when you were reviewing regulation and involved in rate cases or looking at decisions, how did you approach situations where you could look at that, what had been in place or kind of legacy rules and policies that you knew maybe weren't going to be appropriate going forward? How did you approach those or think about those as it relates to trying to make changes in that area?
So early on, like I said, when everybody was looking at technology and innovation, and doing a review of regulations that may get in the way of that, the focus was always on, long-term benefits. You can't have outdated regulations that create barriers to innovation, but how do you do that when it takes so long to change a regulation, when it takes a long time to pass legislation? So you always had to look at the long term and how you were going to be able to accomplish what you were hoping to accomplish while maintaining our role, which was to balance interests and making sure that all of these benefits would be affordable for everyone and accessible to everybody. So that was always kind of the balance. And I think how we approached it at the Illinois Commerce Commission, and how most regulators approach it across the country. We inherit the laws and regulations that the legislators pass, and then we try to work as well as we can within those. And it's up to the utilities to come up with creative ways to go long term and think about how they're going to adapt those innovative technologies within the law that exists.
Yeah, that's great. I mean, I kind of just look at it too. I mean, I think your comments earlier around the pace of change and acceleration, and just an example of the pandemic and the time and the changes that needed to take place and the decisions that had to come about as a result of it to address the environment, right? And making decisions that were going to be in the best interest of all parties to help identify and deal with what was coming down the path over the upcoming months. And now that's extended beyond just that.
Yep.
I've sat on the other side, on the utility side, going through similar processes, working with the regulators to come up with the right policies and decisions as it relates to kind of working with customers. And so I know today, right, the pace of change around technology, for example, right, looking at it from the standpoint, it touches really all aspects of the industry and is impacting it in a lot of different ways on the generation resource side, transmission distribution, and the customer service side and others. When you look at the changes that are happening at the speed they are, do you think, are you able to keep up? Are regulators and commissioners, are they able to keep up with that change as a result of being able to put policies in place that addresses the speed of which that is taking place to help make sure it's a balance right across all stakeholders?
I think regulators are able to keep up, especially if they're involved in learning as much as possible and meeting with the stakeholders to know what they need to know about things that are upcoming that they've never heard about, that they need to understand, how they function, how it's going to affect ratepayers. I think regulators can keep up very well, but regulations cannot keep up with the pace of change. They're put in place, and then there's an entire legal process in order to change and amend that. And by the time that all takes place, you might not even need those changes anymore because something else.
Exactly.
Yeah.
So, I mean, do you see that? I'm just curious. I mean, is there ways to try to address that looking forward, or is that something that all parties just need to kind of recognize that's how things work, have worked, and be able to be, as you suggested, be creative, look for ways to get to the right answer within the context of how some of those systems are set up and policies are set up today?
I think that the quicker that you can bring these new technologies before a regulator so that they understand how important they are and what benefit they'll provide to ratepayers and how they're going to be affected by that, the sooner that you can do that, the sooner that everything that needs to take place after in order to get that implemented will happen. So I think that educating regulators and commissions on these new technologies is important, so long as it doesn't violate any of our,
Sure.
ex parte communications. But and I also think that maybe making yourselves open to pilot projects and making the case for a pilot project before the commission is also is a very good way to come up with a creative way to at least show everybody that's involved and everyone that's impacted, this is why this matters, this is why it's important, and look at all the benefits you're going to get in the end. So I think pilot projects are great when it comes to testing out and studying these technologies and innovations.
Perfect. No, I couldn't agree more. I've seen that as well. I know at our place, we do the same thing, try to encourage things to be able to innovate, right? The innovation process to be able to get things out there, test them out, demonstrate how they work, value they can create, and then take them back and be able to look at that on a broader scale. And it sounds like the same thing can apply in the regulatory process to help facilitate change, maybe at a quicker pace as a result of it. That's fantastic. Let's transition a little bit on to talk about a little bit about utility data. And what we're seeing a little bit as an emerging trend around regulating utility data platforms. What is your thought around that? What does regulation look like in your perspective around utility data?
So regulation around utility data is right now, I think, very much policy driven. So the idea behind the development of statewide data platforms is easier access to energy use data for customers and for market participants. But you have to maintain privacy policies while doing that. And you have to educate consumers on what those privacy policies are so that they're comfortable, I think, sharing that data. I think we're all being conditioned more and more every day to share our data. I feel like there's nothing I can do on my phone that doesn't require me to share all of these things that I don't want to share, whether it's a new app an app for my 12-year-old son, I just feel like I'm constantly sharing data that I don't want to share, even if it's just my email address. Maybe I don't want another person having my email address so I can be bombarded with emails all day. But I think we're all just getting conditioned to let go of that a little bit. But as long as I know that my privacy is still a big priority for the company that I'm sharing my data with, and that I know what those privacy policies are, I have a little bit more of a comfort level. So I think regulators need to understand what those privacy policies are, what the use of the data is going to be for, and have systems in place if they choose to go down this path of being involved in the regulation of energy data, to make sure that they have customer consent. They know about the policies revolving customer consent to share data, that they allow the customers to access their own data about them. Like I said before, disclosing privacy practices, limiting the amount of data to the purposes specified. So not going, beyond that. Controlling somehow the granularity of the data transferred, regarding precautions against data security threats. That's a huge thing that I think we're all worried about, not just in the energy space, but in the healthcare space. Nobody wants their healthcare data to be compromised. And also, just having a tool to encourage compliance. So I think if regulators understand all of those when they're implementing statewide data platforms, in order to make it easier for all of us involved to see how the energy use data is going to be used and what's going to be done with it, I think regulators will be comfortable.
You think it'll be, there's been some work going on in New Hampshire, recent passage by the New York PSC with the same type of kind of broad platform, right, around data management across utilities. NYSERDA, I believe, is going to be the program sponsor and going to drive some of that. But it's a long initiative, right? If I remember correctly in reviewing it, it's a two-phase approach. It's over several years. So when you look at it kind of broadly, what do you think the forces are that are driving maybe this direction around regulating utility data, creating these kind of statewide platforms? What's moving us maybe that direction?
I think what's moving in this direction is that we suddenly have all of this data available. 10 years ago, not every state had smart meters, but suddenly this data is available. We all know that it can be useful to benefit consumers and to benefit grid modernization and to have the integration of clean energy and having people be able to put their own resources onto the grid. So all of this data is necessary, and the exchange of this data is also necessary. So I think that's what's driving states to be paying attention to this in the energy space. The question is, how are we always have to worry about consumers being harmed, and we don't want consumers being harmed. And the harm for consumers in this is when it comes to their privacy being breached. So I think those are the things that's what's driving it, and that's what's scaring regulators.
Gotcha. No, I mean, it makes sense. I think it'll be interesting to watch some of these early adopters in some of these states as they begin to put the pieces together and bring the stakeholders together. I think being able to have, to your point early on, around early wins and demonstrating, some ways of creating value around the platform early on, not only with all the different stakeholders and constituents, but also from a market perspective, will be good to watch. And I guess we'll see kind of together how that transfers over into other states as they start to look and think about similar things. I think sometimes when people think about regulation, regulatory kind of databases or platforms, and then they can think about innovation, sometimes the question may be, is that a good partnership, right? Are those things you need to come together? So when you look at what may be transpiring, do you see this as something that's going to enhance innovation, enhance collaboration across participants and partnerships across utilities and other providers?
Absolutely. I think for sure, no doubt. I think it's going to create collaboration. when I first started learning about smart meters and learning about all of the data that was available as a result of having, all of these smart meters across, the state in Illinois, one of the things that I was wondering about was, well, do you need 3 different meters in your house? Can you just have one meter for all of your utilities? So you don't have, but those are that's something to be considered. And of course, I think, everyone in this space, and as long as this information is being used again for long-term benefits for customers and not for some nefarious, use, I think, it's something that needs to be part of the discussion and collaboration between utilities and between electricity, natural gas, and water. Why not? I think that's great.
Sure. I mean, I don't disagree. I look at it too, right? When you think about the decarbonization goals that are taking place state by state, continuing to expand, and you look at the different stakeholders in those regions that have to be a part of accomplishing those goals, I think there does, there's momentum and kind of, being able to leverage some core platforms that all stakeholders and parties can take advantage of, right? And I think it also can bring those parties together, to your point earlier, from a collaborative standpoint. So everyone may have, come at it from different angles, but effectively kind of one broad overarching goal is to help deliver on these broader decarbonization targets that are coming up over 2030, 2045. That can't just all be resource driven, right? It has to be a combination of supply side and demand side. And I think this type of data consolidation allows some of the demand side activities maybe to be more easily implemented. But to your point, be able to test it out, get it out there. I think speed is going to be important. So it'll be interesting to watch what happens in New York, and then as other states maybe follow, how they begin to build out platforms to take advantage, because technology will move a lot quicker, right? Than maybe some of the ways these programs are designed, and the market will move quicker. So figuring out how to create a balance around that, at least from my perspective, will be interesting to watch, especially as a firm in the data business, in terms of what we do and working with customers and utilities, kind of seeing how some of that plays out over time. When you think about this area and, in the role you had, and you kind of think about regulatory commissioners thinking about maybe moving this direction, how would you guide them in this process? What steps should they be thinking about if they wanted to move this direction?
So I think commissions across the country, if they're starting to think about this, and you mentioned New Hampshire, New York, Minnesota, they are currently looking at this right now. I think the best way to start gathering information in an open, transparent way is to either initiate a workshop inviting all stakeholders to participate. In Illinois, at the Illinois Commerce Commission, what we use, well, I'll speak in the past because I'm not there anymore, but there was this process on the docket called a notice of inquiry. And a notice of inquiry just invites stakeholders to provide comments, information on whatever topic we are asking for information about. So we've done a lot of those. We did one last March, right before the pandemic hit, on affordability and what that means to consumers. So it can range from any kind of topic that the commission is interested in finding out more. So I would recommend opening a docket similar to a notice of inquiry, which invites stakeholders to provide comments on, what is it that the commission as the regulators, and also that legislators as the lawmakers, and the governor of the state, what do they need to know, when they're considering the development of a statewide data platform. So I think that would be a good way to go about it. A notice of inquiry type of docket, or some kind of a workshop.
And in general, kind of what, if you kind of think about the timing, if you put yourself back in at the Illinois Commerce Commission, what does that timeline look like, right? If they were starting from kind of the beginning today and beginning to capture that, maybe what does that timeline look like to get to maybe where something's being proposed, like we've seen in New York, New Hampshire, Minnesota, as an example?
So I think a good timeline is probably 6 months to a year. You can make that timeline as tight as you want to make it. As a commission, you can say, here's our notice of inquiry. We're giving parties this long to provide comments, and then you give the staff at your commission this long to review the comments. So barely a good, docket like this would take anywhere from 6 months to a year
Okay.
before you
Great.
get
Well,
the
so-
report, filing everything together.
Perfect. Well, I think it'll be interesting to watch, right? I mean, I think it's, with some of the work that's gone on, as I mentioned earlier, with this, and you said as well, in the states that we've been kind of watching and paying attention to, we'll watch and see how this progresses. And again, I think technology will play a key role in that, because I think it comes from a couple different areas, right? It comes from the standardization of building that statewide platform, but to your point as well, the privacy piece, right? And making sure from a data security standpoint, all those pieces are addressed to make sure that information is managed in the right way and the access
Yes,
that goes along with it.
And of course, the cost, how is it going to
Yeah.
be paid for?
Yeah, paid for, and the value that comes along with it, right?
Right.
I mean, I think,
Yeah.
some of these, I think timing is important, right? Kind of back to our earlier conversation on the regulatory process and legislation and the pieces around that and the time it takes to make changes. This is another good example, right? I mean, 5 years in some cases is a lifetime in technology and technology products, right? In terms of what we're doing. But I think you also have to have a long-term view, right? This is something that's never been done before, and being able to put it in place to see how it looks and progresses, making changes along the way with a long-term view of what it's really designed to do, which at the end of the day, hopefully is allowing all sides to be able to be more proactive in how they manage and utilize energy, right? Both on the resource side and on the demand side. Well, that's fantastic. So one more last question as we get ready to wrap this up. So in terms of the time you've spent on the commission as well, and just thinking in general across your peers, partnerships I think are important, right? And I think the utility and regulatory commission partnership is an important one. Oftentimes they're linked together to be able to accomplish something that you're trying to put in place looking forward. How have you approached that relationship in times where maybe the utility and the commission is aligned to help really drive something? And how does that partnership look like?
So I think it's very important to have partnerships with your stakeholders, not only the utilities, but all of the stakeholders involved. And I think a very good example and a very good success story in Illinois, and looking back to when I served on the commission, and I have to go back to the collaboration during the pandemic. Everyone came together, the utilities, the consumer advocates, and the commission staff, in putting together right away the moratorium on disconnections. Many utilities did that voluntarily. And then as the parties were, negotiating and involved in how we were going to come out of this without massively impacting, low income consumers that were just so far behind. So I think that's a great example of collaboration with regulators, utilities, and consumer advocates and other stakeholders on doing what's best for Illinois. I think that's a really good story to look at. And one more thing I will say about pilot projects and testing out these innovations. I think a good example to always look back to and to always study for anyone looking to present this to a commission, look at how successful the smart meter rollout was in Illinois. I mean, this was put in place. This started out as a pilot project, and then, years later, everybody in Illinois has a smart meter. So I think that's a good example to look at how this can work.
No, that's perfect. That's a great example. One question for the audience, maybe I'll just kind of read it real quick, and it kind of falls in line with what we talked about earlier. And it's really around kind of the changes going on in the space, right? Grid monetization, data-driven decision-making, more technology wrapped around all phases of the business. How is that changing the role of the regulator? Or maybe to your point, the makeup of kind of the skill sets that a regulator brings to his or her role on the commission?
So that's a lot to think about. I don't know that there is one skill set in particular that a regulator needs, other than an open mind, being open to listening to all of these new ideas, because everybody has a different interest in mind that they want to share with us, and something that they're, wanting to accomplish. So, being a lawyer helps. You don't have to be a lawyer to be a regulator, but that does help because you can analyze a lot of concepts, pretty well. I feel like having an accounting background, is very necessary as a regulator. I didn't have one, so I really had to rely heavily on staff when it came to accounting issues, engineering and economics. And those are all the things that make a really good regulator, and someone with a policy background. So we don't just look at rate cases anymore, maybe
No, that's
regulators.
exactly right. Yeah.
Yes, it isn't just about that, because there's just so much changing and so much happening, that an open mind is, I think, the most important thing for a regulator to have, as long as we're balancing the interests of our commission.
Well, and I think too, this conversation is focused on the energy and water space, right? But the reality is those commissions have a broader purview in many cases over multiple industries, not just the one that we're talking about today. So I think your comments are so relevant in that sense, because you have to have a kind of a broad perspective, right? You kind of bring a variety of skill sets to the role, but being able to take a broad, holistic look at what's going on across industries that also and how they're impacting different stakeholders. And at the end of the day, that consumer is and balance is so important. And I think your point earlier on the examples of the partnership around creating equity in the space across all customer segments.
Yes.
I think we're seeing that become a bigger piece of the dialogue in the industry, especially with the administration's new big proposal on infrastructure that has such an important part on climate change, which I think is extremely important to move that forward. But at the same time, we have to make sure that we're bringing all groups along with it and creating the right parameters to be able to make sure that's going to happen. And that's going to be really important. That's going to be an industry responsibility with all the stakeholders to make sure we put pieces in place to allow that to happen in the right way. Well, Sadzi, thank you so much. This has been a great conversation. Really appreciate the time today and the insights you provided. I'm sure we could spend more time, and there's a lot more questions. We'll make sure to add you back on the invite list as well. But thank you again. Really appreciate the thoughts and feedback. So with that, next up is going to be Jason and Laurel, absolutely, to talk about Laurel's lessons learned. So that'll be coming up here in a few seconds. So thanks again, Sadzi. Thank you, everybody.